We're here with former Governor Dan Evans, former Governor, United States Senator, President of the Evergreen State College, and five-term Secretary of State Ralph Munro. 1968, the year that changed the world. Dan was running for re-election, keynoter at the Republican National Convention at Miami Beach. Situate me, Ralph. Where were you in 1968? Were you on Dan's staff already?
No.
You were not?
No, but we were actively campaigning for him, and I was working for the legislature. And we had worked for his election since 1964 as students up at Western Washington University, young Republicans, and had always been pretty enthusiastic supporters of what he represented.
You know, I wrote a lot in this project about Action for Washington, the action team of Evans and Kramer and Gorton and Fletcher. I'm wondering, did you play a role in that?
No, not at all.
Okay.
But I was involved in some of their activities and went to a lot of activities. But those guys really had that well organized. We were doing everything from putting up signs to handing out brochures at county fairs to any place we were needed. We were trying to do. We were trying to doorbell as many precincts in the Seattle area as we could. Huge doorbell. It was a totally different type of campaign in those days. But we were very involved in that entire effort, and then of course again in '72.
Dan, Stuart Ellenway and I were talking about Art Fletcher because I covered that campaign. I picked up Art and Slade Gorton when they made their swing through Southwest Washington, and my thesis is that Art was such a magnetic, transitional, charismatic figure. Do you think that if Art Fletcher had been elected Lieutenant Governor in 1968, that his future was really bright in elective politics?
Oh, I sure do. But you got to think back to 1968. That was a time when it was really tough, racially. In fact, I had, after the election was over and Art had lost by such a small margin, I had a number of people come to me and said, they're good Republicans. And they said, Governor, I just couldn't vote for Mr. Fletcher. And finally, an elderly woman came to me and said, why? She said, Governor, I was afraid that if he were elected lieutenant governor, the radicals would attempt to assassinate you to make him governor. And I thought, what foolishness, absolute foolishness.
And
that was a time when there were still those fears.
Art Fletcher had a unique ability. You could put him in a room with a group of racists, and they'd walk out of the room and vote for him. He could win people over like nobody I've ever seen.
Yeah. I've seen speeches where he'd have the audience almost in tears and 5 minutes later just rolling in the aisles laughing. So he was a great communicator.
One of the biggest crowds ever to attend any event in Kitsap County was to hear Art Fletcher speak at the Lincoln Day dinner. Just an amazing speech, and when you get people like Adele Ferguson rallying about what a great job he was doing, and a lot of those folks were pretty racist, and they came around.
Yeah. But there was still enough of them left, still enough people with fears and prejudices that couldn't quite get over it.
Well, the racist, the Birch Society Weekly over there in Yakima, the Yakima Eagle, sent out this flyer. They did an overrun on a bunch of issues that featured Art on the front page. They'd captured him somehow out mowing his lawn, sort of in a sweaty T-shirt, and the caption was, "Meet your next governor." So the thing was that, and there was also that notion that if Art were elected, that you were going to resign or run for the Senate or whatever, and it was a done deal.
Yeah. Well, also remember that we had another African American leader assassinated right about the same time, Ed Pratt in Seattle. Walked right up to his door and knocked on the door and gunned him down. And
of course Martin Luther King that spring.
Exactly. Absolutely. And 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy.
Right. Yeah. This was not easy times.
No. When we think of those events that Walter Cronkite used to say, those events that alter and illuminate our times, I was 25 in 1968, and it seemed like it was one thing after another. There was such cataclysm. And the Republican convention that you keynoted in Miami Beach came hard on the heels of this incredible disruption in Chicago with Mayor Daley's police throttling the protesters and delegates. What was you were against the advice of some of your aides. You held that all of your aides. You were a Rockefeller man.
Yes.
Tell us the story that I think is really wonderful about Spiro Agnew, and who had been a Rockefeller person. Sure. Tell us that story.
Well, it's fascinating because early in the spring of 1968, I started calling my fellow governors and urging them to back Rockefeller. In fact, we had a pretty good group that were all on Rockefeller's side because we'd all worked with him closely as governor. And when I called Ted Agnew, he said, "Oh, I'm really for him, and I'll get out there and make phone calls and all of that." So he was really, at that time, for Rockefeller.
Yeah.
And then Rocky announced that he was holding a press conference to announce his decision on running. And Agnew got a whole bunch of reporters in his office and listened to it because after it was over, he was going to announce that he was backing Rockefeller. Well, that's when Rockefeller said that he was not running. And that embarrassed Agnew to the point that he switched. Of course, he might have been embarrassed, but he was also pretty ambitious. And he switched from Rockefeller to Nixon at that moment.
After the keynote speech, and in the next couple of days before the selection of a vice presidential candidate, if I recall correctly, you were on a national interview, and was the story that Neil McReynolds or one of your aides came up to the window while the taping was going on? Tell us about that.
Well, this was the day after the selection of the president. Nixon had won. The next morning I was on Capitol Cloakroom, which was a big program in those days, and we were talking about the vice presidency and wondering, and that's when Neil came up and just put a sign on the window outside of it saying, "It's Agnew," which stunned both of us because neither the interviewer nor I even thought about him. But as it turned out, pretty good reason that he was selected, because it was close enough. Nixon wasn't absolutely certain, but he had done a good job early on of going into the South and getting people to support him. And then Reagan came through the South later on and just wowed people, but they had already made their decision and their commitments to Nixon. And Strom Thurmond, who was one of the leaders in the South in those days as well as much later, said, "Well, Mr. Nixon, we're for you with one condition, that you will select a vice president that will be acceptable to the South." And Nixon made that commitment. And of course, none of the press or anybody else knew anything about that, but that sure killed any chance of most of the ones that were being viewed as possible vice presidents.
There's one of the great pictures from that era involving the Evans family. Who was the youngster that when Spiro Agnew as vice president visited the governor, visited Olympia and went to the mansion?
Our youngest son,
Evans.
Bruce. Yeah.
Was that Bruce is the youngest?
He was the youngest.
So what did Nancy do? That Bruce was not exactly enamored of meeting the vice president of the United States, was he?
No, he was not. Well, he's not enamored of having to get dressed up in long socks and shorts and a coat and all that sort of stuff, and decided that he did not want to meet the vice president, which didn't mean anything to him anyhow. And Nancy pushed him into it, and he did his job. He was shaking hands, head down, and tears just coming down his face. I don't know what he knew that the rest of us didn't at the time.
He did know.
You might note that Bruce has that picture on his desk now in Washington, D.C. with a note under it that says, "You see, I was right."
Right all along.
Yeah.
So when did Ralph Munro first come to work in the Evans administration?
Well, actually, I was working for the legislature here, and then started to introduce the governor in the rotunda during the daily talks to the school people, and kind of got to know each other then. And then his visit to Fircrest School and so forth. And so we kind of slowly but surely found ourselves together. it's just been a great opportunity in my life, and I tell people I'd still be working in the kitchen or the bill room if it wasn't for this guy. But I think there's one other point I want to make, John, that is really important to this era, because you're talking about the assassinations and all the tumultuous things that were happening. But there's one thing that's different, and that is in 1968, those things were happening in our living room for the first time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In the other days before that, even in the early 60s, those things were happening somewhere else. Yep. That was in the South, or that's way over there in San Diego, or that's up in Camden. And suddenly it's in our living room. And it's Bull Connor and his dogs on the Selma Bridge, or it's a scene from, a terrible tragedy of a problem in Vietnam or part of the war, or it's whatever it happened to be. And that, to me, was the real change agent of how people really started to react.
Sure, you could read about Bull Connor in a front page newspaper story, and even with pictures. It doesn't make anywhere near the impact that the age of television did.
And it's amazing what people remember when you go back and talk to people our age and older. Those are the things they do remember. And it was just like you said, one event after another. And it almost felt like the country was coming apart. And that's where it requires stable, really mature leadership, where, we've got 5,000 kids on the Montlake Bridge marching towards town, but are we going to react to people that say shoot them? No. We're going to go up and try to point out, like he did on live television, that they hadn't done as much damage as it cost to clean up after a Husky football game. And that's what it takes. That's the difference.
Well, Walt Crowley and Quintard Taylor talked about Dan Evans's role during that era and the outreach that you made to the central area. That's a good story. We're short on time, but it's worth telling. And you set up a multi-service center to help with social services in the predominantly black central area of Seattle. And at that opening, if I recall, Dan, someone said from that community said something really meaningful to you.
Sure, and the history of that really was time. I just spent a day up in the central area in August of 1967, and things were pretty tense. But people came in to say whatever they wanted, and most of them just had personal problems. But the last group were about 6 teenagers who came in, and they were mad, and finally one of them just sat at one end of the table and he pointed his finger at me like this: "Governor, if I had a gun right now, I'd shoot you." And there was silence for a time because I was trying to get my thoughts together. And I said, "Well, what good would that do?" And he said, "One less honky to deal with." And then that was too much for the rest of them. And then they started getting into more specifics. Ultimately, I said, "You've told me all the things that are wrong. Come down in a week and tell me what we should do about it." And I thought I'd never see them again. A week later, they showed up dressed in their best clothes, and we spent 2 hours going through all of the things that they thought needed to be done. And the Multiservice Center concept was one that really was pretty dramatic. And I said, okay, we're going to have that up and running in 30 days. 30 days later, it was running, and about 2 weeks after that, we had a formal opening packed with people from the community. And this woman came up to me and she said, "Governor, how do you like our center?" And she captured in just a few words what government really ought to be about, because normally it's your center or their center or the dumb center or something like that. But when it was our center, it made a real difference.
And in some ways, that was the birth of DSHS.
Absolutely.
The fact that if you came in as a family and you maybe had a blind child, they'd say, "Oh, you have to go over to the services for the blind. They're located, 6 miles that way." or if you've got a child that needs some other kind of help, maybe hearing disorder or anything. And families do have multiple problems. And they would just shift them all over town, and families just gave up. They just didn't know what to do. And we had families that had disabled and handicapped children. They just put them in the back room and left them there because they had nowhere to turn. And
that's what those youngsters really pointed it out very clearly to me when they said, Governor, why do we have to go 2 bus rides in one direction for the health department and 2 bus rides in the other direction for public assistance? Why can't they have a center where the people who need the help are located?
What a concept.
Yeah.
Okay, gentlemen, the Secretary of State beckons, and I don't want to be in trouble with the Secretary of State.
thank you, John.
Okay,
Thanks for doing it.
thank